For 5 years, I, Elena, 54, believed my husband Arthur loved me for who I was, completely blind to the agonizing lie that my stepson Julian viewed me as a penniless gold digger. Everything shattered at a Seattle waterfront rehearsal dinner when Julian raised his glass and publicly mocked me as a charity case. That single, arrogant toast triggered an irreversible chain reaction. How deep did the betrayal go? I quickly uncovered forged signatures on a loan, my secret warehouse stolen as collateral, and Arthur's own quiet complicity. In just 72 hours, our entire family dynamic collapsed. And Arthur, who sat calmly buttering a warm piece of dinner bread, had absolutely no idea his comfortable world of lies was about to implode. Before I tell you what happened next, if you enjoy stories about justice and family boundaries, take a second to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Where are you watching from right now? And what time is it there? Drop a comment and let me know. I'd like everyone to meet my dad's gold digger. The words hit the room so hard that for a second I honestly thought I'd misheard them. Then came the laughter. Not from everyone, but enough. Enough to make my face burn. Enough to make me wish I was anywhere else. I sat frozen at a round table inside a private banquet room at a boutique hotel overlooking the Seattle waterfront, staring at my stepson Julian while he stood holding a champagne glass. He was smiling. Not a nervous smile, not an awkward smile, but a proud, triumphant grin. The kind someone wears when they think they've just delivered the perfect, devastating joke. "This is Elena," he continued, gesturing toward me with his free hand. "My dad's wife." A few people in the room nodded politely, their expressions tight. Then Julian's grin widened. Or, as I like to call her, Dad's personal charity case. More laughter rippled through the space. My stomach tightened into a hard, cold knot. I glanced toward my husband, Arthur. He laughed too. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't malicious. It was just a soft, dismissive chuckle. Just enough. Just enough for me to notice, and somehow, that hurt infinitely worse than Julian's outright hostility. Julian had never liked me, he had made that clear from the moment Arthur and I married 5 years ago. But Arthur was my husband. Arthur was supposed to have my back. I lowered my eyes toward the tablecloth, crisp white linen, heavy silver, a half-empty glass of sparkling water. At 54 years old, I had survived brutal business betrayals, the collapse of a shipping venture during a major economic downturn, grueling 70-hour work weeks, and the quiet, devastating grief of losing my father years ago. Yet somehow, a cheap joke at a rehearsal dinner managed to hit harder than almost any of it. It is funny how life works. Julian raised his glass again, basking in the attention of the room. I mean, look at her. A few people chuckled, encouraged by his confidence. She married my dad and retired right after. Stopped working entirely to tend to her little backyard plants. Pretty sweet deal if you ask me. More laughter. I didn't respond. Honestly, I couldn't, because if I opened my mouth at that moment, I wasn't sure what would come out. The room felt suddenly smaller, suffocatingly warm. My right knee was throbbing, a dull, persistent ache. A storm was coming. It always did that before the heavy Pacific Northwest rain set in. I reached for my water glass and took a slow, deliberate drink, using the physical motion to anchor myself. Across the room, Chloe looked embarrassed. That was something, at least. At least one person in Julian's orbit seemed to recognize the cruelty of the moment. Chloe was Julian's fiancée. She was a quiet girl, polite, always working hard at her family's organic distribution business. I had always liked her. She opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something, to defuse the tension, but then she caught Julian's eye and closed it again. I couldn't blame her. Nobody expects ugly family drama during a celebratory dinner, especially not 15 minutes before the main course is served. The truth was, Julian and I had been doing this dance for years. Not this exact performance, but close. Little comments, passive-aggressive digs, small, pointed reminders that I wasn't his mother, that I was an outsider who had slid into his father's life to enjoy a comfortable ride. At first, I had ignored it, chalking it up to the resentment of a young man adjusting to a stepmother. Then I tolerated it for Arthur's sake. Eventually, it became background noise. Or at least, I had convinced myself it had. Apparently not. Sitting there that night, I realized those comments hadn't disappeared, they had been piling up somewhere deep inside me, like heavy wet snow on a weak roof. One small flurry at a time, until eventually, the weight became too much to bear. I looked around the room. Most of Chloe's family didn't know me. Why would they? I wasn't the center of this upcoming wedding. I was just the quiet woman married to the groom's father, the retired local florist who spent her days in a small backyard greenhouse. They had no reason to question Julian's version of me. An older, dependent woman living in his father's house, spending his father's retirement funds. It was a simple story. An easy story. People love easy stories because they don't require any thought. The reality, of course, was far more complicated. My father had been a long-haul truck driver, a man who spent his life traversing the interstate highways of this country to put food on our table. He taught me the value of grit, the mechanics of transport, and the sheer power of quiet determination. From those humble beginnings, I had built a logistics and commercial greenhouse empire. By the time I met Arthur, I was wealthy beyond anything his family could comprehend. But I had grown tired of the constant spotlight, the endless board meetings, and the superficiality of high society circles. When I retired, I wanted peace. I bought a modest home, built a small greenhouse in the backyard, and let the world believe I was just a simple, retired florist. I wanted a partner who loved me for who I was, not my balance sheet. Arthur seemed to fit that bill. But tonight, the illusion felt like a trap of my own making. Julian finally sat down, looking thoroughly pleased with himself. Conversation resumed around the table. Forks clinked against porcelain. Servers moved seamlessly through the room, carrying trays of seared salmon and roasted vegetables. Everyone pretended nothing unusual had happened. But I couldn't shake the cold feeling that something fundamental had changed. Not because of Julian, but because of Arthur. The image of him laughing, of his easy, complicit smile, kept replaying in my mind like a broken film strip. A harmless joke. That is probably what he would call it if I brought it up. He would tell me I was being too sensitive, that Julian was just letting off steam, that I was tougher than that. Maybe he simply didn't realize how tired I was. Tired of being underestimated. Tired of being explained away. Tired of feeling like I needed to justify my presence in my own home. I was reaching for a piece of bread when I noticed a sudden shift in movement across the room. Chloe's father, Marcus Sterling. He had been quiet throughout the entire exchange, sitting tall and observing with a stillness that was almost imposing. Marcus was not a dramatic man. He was a self-made distributor who ran a massive organic food distribution network. He understood logistics, supply chains, and, above all, the people who controlled them. When he stood up, the room naturally paid attention. He looked directly at Julian. There was no smile on his face, but there was no anger either. Just a cold, heavy disappointment, the kind of look that is always worse than shouting. "Julian," Marcus said calmly. The room went dead silent. Even the server pouring wine at the next table paused. Julian looked up, momentarily confused, his smug expression faltering. "What's up, Marcus?" Marcus folded his hands in front of him, his gaze steady. "Young man, I think you just made a very serious mistake." The air in the room froze. Julian let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh, looking around for support. "What are you talking about?" "It was just a joke." Marcus didn't answer him. Instead, he turned his head and looked at me for a long, quiet moment. There was a look in his eyes I couldn't quite decipher, recognition, perhaps, or a deep, shared understanding of exactly who I was in the commercial world. Then, without a word, he reached down and grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair. Chloe stood up, her face pale. "Dad?" Marcus ignored the question. He slipped one arm into the jacket, then the other, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The entire room watched him in absolute silence. Nobody understood what was happening. Honestly, neither did I. Finally, Julian spoke again, his voice losing its confident edge. "Did I say something wrong?" Marcus turned toward him, his expression entirely unreadable. "More than you could possibly comprehend." Then he walked out. Just like that. The heavy wooden door of the banquet room closed behind him with a soft, decisive click. Silence followed. Real, heavy silence, the kind that makes people suddenly very interested in the ice melting in their glasses. Julian looked around the room, his face flushed with embarrassment now. Chloe looked utterly confused and distressed. Arthur looked worried, his eyes darting toward the closed door and then to me. And I sat there, my heart beating rapidly against my ribs. Marcus was not the type of man to make a scene. Not ever. If he had reacted that strongly, if he had walked out of his own daughter's rehearsal dinner over a comment made to me, something else was going on. Something hidden. Something I didn't yet understand. The rest of the evening passed in a strange, disjointed blur. Dinner was served, but the food tasted like cardboard. People spoke in hushed, polite tones. The wedding plans were discussed, but the celebratory energy had completely evaporated from the room. Every few minutes, I would catch someone glancing at me, only to look away quickly when our eyes met. Around 9 o'clock, I quietly stood up, took my purse, and excused myself. Nobody tried to stop me. Nobody asked me to stay. I walked through the warm, carpeted hotel lobby and out into the cool, damp Seattle air. The streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, casting long, shimmering fractures of light across the asphalt. A light drizzle had begun to fall. I climbed into my old, faded pickup truck, the one Arthur always complained looked out of place in our driveway, and sat there in the dark for a long moment before turning the key. My phone remained completely silent on the passenger seat. No text from Julian. No apologetic message from Arthur. Nothing. I pulled out of the parking lot and headed north toward home. The windshield wipers swept back and forth, a steady, rhythmic hum against the glass. The dark road stretched ahead of me, but my thoughts remained trapped in that banquet room. I wasn't thinking about Julian's insult, and I wasn't even thinking about Arthur's betrayal. I was thinking about Marcus. The look on his face, the quiet authority in his voice, and the strange, knowing look he had given me before he walked out. What in the world did Marcus Sterling know that I didn't? I barely slept that night. Not because of Julian's childish insults, and not even because of Arthur's disappointing laughter. It was Marcus Sterling. The whole drive back to our house in the quiet hills north of the city, I had replayed those few strange minutes over and over in my head. The look on his face, the steady way he stood up, the deliberate way he walked out of the room. Most people would have called his departure dramatic, even theatrical. But that wasn't Marcus. In the 5 years I had known him through the local business community, I had never seen him act on impulse. Marcus was the kind of man who measured his words like a chemist compounding medicine. He was a self-made distributor who fixed supply chain crises quietly behind closed doors, a man who would rather walk away from a bad deal than waste energy starting a public fight. Which was exactly why his reaction at the hotel banquet room bothered me so deeply. By midnight, I was sitting alone in my kitchen. The house was dark, save for the small, warm light above the stove. Arthur hadn't come home yet. He had texted me briefly to say he was staying at a nearby hotel to help Julian and Chloe manage the fallout of their guests' confusion. Or maybe he just didn't want to ride home with me and face the quiet, heavy atmosphere of our car. At that moment, I wasn't sure which possibility bothered me more. I poured myself a cup of black coffee I didn't need. It was a bad habit left over from my decades in logistics, when a late-night call from a shipping port meant I had to be awake and sharp in an instant. At my age, coffee after midnight was practically a declaration of war against sleep, but I drank it anyway, holding the warm ceramic mug between both hands. Outside, the Seattle rain tapped softly against the windowpane. Inside, the only sound was the low, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator. That was it. Just me, the rain, and a growing, heavy sense that something much bigger than a stupid, disrespectful joke had occurred tonight. At exactly 10:07 p.m., my phone buzzed on the granite countertop. Marcus. I stared at the glowing screen for a few seconds before sliding the bar to answer. Hello, Marcus. His voice sounded tired, stripped of the formal professional veneer he usually maintained. Elena. You home? Yes, I said, keeping my tone level. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, filled only by the faint sound of windshield wipers in the background of his car. We need to talk. Nothing more. No explanation, no polite preamble, no details. Just those 4 words. My stomach tightened. About what, exactly? Not over the phone, Marcus replied. Is Chloe okay? I asked, a sudden wave of concern washing over me. She's fine. But we need to meet. Tomorrow morning. Where? The Ship Canal Diner. Near the industrial docks. Let's say 8 o'clock. I'll be there, I said. He hung up without a formal goodbye. I stared at my phone as the screen went dark. For the first time all evening, Julian's public insult wasn't the primary thing occupying my mind. It was Marcus. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. My right knee was still aching from the shifting weather, and the local forecast predicted 3 more days of steady, gray rain. Getting older is a funny thing. When you are young, you think pain only comes from major injuries, but when you cross 50, you realize pain can come from simply existing in a damp climate. I showered, pulled my hair back into a practical clip, and drove toward the canal. The roads were slick, reflecting the early morning headlights of commuter traffic. School buses were starting their routes, and the city was slowly grinding into motion, moving forward as if nothing had changed. The diner sat right where the industrial district met the water, a weathered building with a faded neon sign that had survived decades of gentrification. It was the kind of place where tugboat captains, freight loaders, and local contractors gathered, people who didn't care about artisanal espresso or organic avocado toast. When I walked through the door, the familiar, comforting smell of bacon grease, old coffee, and toasted sourdough hit me. Marcus was already there, sitting in a vinyl booth near the back window. He had a mug of black coffee in front of him and a folded newspaper beside his hand. He looked older than he had the night before, his shoulders slightly rounded under his dark canvas jacket. He nodded as I approached. Morning, Elena. Marcus, I said, sliding into the booth opposite him. A waitress appeared almost immediately, pouring a fresh cup of coffee for me without asking. We sat in silence for a moment, watching the gray rain ripple across the canal outside the window. You know what bothered me most last night? Marcus asked, his eyes still fixed on the water. I waited, letting him find his own timing. It wasn't what Julian said. Marcus turned his gaze back to me, his expression remarkably serious. It was the fact that he believed it. Completely and utterly. I frowned, the coffee mug warm against my palms. Julian has never liked me, Marcus. He's made a sport of it for 5 years. No, Elena, you don't understand. Marcus leaned forward, lowering his voice so it wouldn't carry to the next booth. He isn't just throwing tantrums. He's been building a narrative. Do you know how many times Chloe has come home repeating stories about how you are living off Arthur's hard-earned retirement? I blinked, the words landing like a physical blow. What? For months, Marcus said, shaking his head. Julian has been telling anyone who will listen that you are a financial burden on his father. He's told Chloe's family that you don't contribute a dime, that you retired early to play with your backyard plants while Arthur carries the mortgage on your house. My stomach sank. And people believe this? Why wouldn't they? Marcus shrugged. You live quietly. You drive an old truck. You don't talk about your past, and you don't flash money around. To an outsider, it looks exactly like the story Julian is telling. A simple story of a middle-aged woman who found a comfortable retirement plan in a naive husband. I looked down at the dark liquid in my cup. A joke is one thing, a systematically constructed lie is something else entirely. This wasn't just a momentary lapse in judgment at a rehearsal dinner. It was a calculated belief, repeated often enough that it had become accepted as truth within Julian's circle. I had no idea, I admitted quietly. I figured as much, Marcus sighed, rubbing his temples. That's why I got angry last night. I can't stand seeing a good person slandered by someone who is actively planning to take advantage of them. What do you mean, taking advantage? I asked, my analytical instincts suddenly kicking in. Marcus hesitated, looking around the diner before continuing. Julian has been talking about the future. Specifically, your future. He's told Chloe's family that he expects to inherit the property north of the city. I froze. My property? The house and the land? Yes. He talks about it like it's already his. He's even mentioned plans to renovate the main house and clear out your greenhouse to build a private training facility for his new fitness franchise. Marcus shook his head in disgust. He's planning his entire business expansion around assets he believes belong to his father, assets he assumes will eventually fall into his hands. A cold, sharp clarity began to settle over me. The expensive venue, the sudden confidence, the unearned entitlement, it all started to make sense. Julian wasn't just being disrespectful, he was quietly positioning himself to inherit a fortune he believed his father owned. And Arthur, in his desire to keep the peace, had allowed the lie to grow. He thinks the house is Arthur's, I whispered. Exactly, Marcus said. And he thinks you are just a tenant who will be easily pushed aside when the time comes. I looked out the window at the gray Seattle sky. The irony was almost laughable. For years, I had been slandered as a gold digger. Meanwhile, the stepson who despised me was quietly drawing up blueprints to build his future on my foundation. Thank you, Marcus, I said, my voice steadying. I just thought you should know the truth, Elena. You've been too kind for too long. By the time I got back to the house, Arthur still wasn't home. The silence of the empty rooms felt different now, no longer peaceful, but charged with an impending storm. I walked down the hallway to my small home office at the back of the house. I opened the bottom drawer of my oak filing cabinet, pulled out a thick manila folder, and sat down at my desk. If Julian believed my future belonged to him, it was time to calculate exactly how much of my past I had already spent on his present. I opened a fresh spreadsheet on my computer and began to enter the numbers. By the time I opened the third drawer of the filing cabinet in my home office, I already knew this was a bad idea. Not because I was afraid of what I would find, but because I suspected I was finally going to be forced to look at things I had spent years deliberately avoiding. The office sat at the quiet back corner of the house, overlooking a dense stand of cedar trees that dripped with morning mist. It was a small room, furnished with a heavy cedar desk, 2 bookshelves packed with old logistics manuals, and a single framed photograph hanging on the wall. The photo showed me, 25 years younger, standing in front of my first commercial greenhouse facility in the Kent Valley, surrounded by a small, proud crew of freight loaders. Most days, I barely used this room anymore. Retirement changes your daily rhythms. For the first few years, I would still wake up at 5 in the morning, expecting a frantic call about a delayed shipping container or a broken heating system in one of the floral cultivation bays. Then I would remember there were no more crews, no more freight deadlines, and no more subcontractors calling with emergencies. There was only coffee, the quiet hum of the Pacific Northwest morning, and my small backyard greenhouse. But on this morning, I wasn't retired. Not mentally. I felt like an auditor preparing for a forensic investigation, only the subject of the audit was my own life, and the cost of my silence. I started with the most recent expenses. The upcoming wedding. Julian and Chloe's venue deposit alone had cost more than the down payment on my first commercial delivery truck in the early 90s. I opened a blue folder, found the signed contract, and highlighted the line item, deposit, $35,000, paid by Elena Vance. I stared at the number. When I had signed that check, I hadn't hesitated. I had wanted them to have a beautiful start. I wanted Julian to feel supported, to believe that his new stepmother was genuinely invested in his happiness. That is what family does, or at least, that was the belief I had carried with me. I opened a fresh spreadsheet on my computer and entered the first figure. Then I kept digging. The next folder contained the records from Julian's various business ventures and personal setbacks. 3 years ago, he decided he wanted to be a certified elite personal trainer and wellness consultant. He had begged Arthur for the capital to attend exclusive seminars and obtain high-end certifications. Arthur didn't have the liquid cash at the time, so I had quietly stepped in. Trainer certifications and specialized business seminars, $18,000. Next was the failed marketing campaign for a fitness app he had abandoned 6 months after launch. He had come to our kitchen table, talking fast about algorithms and digital reach, looking so desperate that my heart had ached for him. App development and marketing rescue, $28,000. Then came the lease penalty for his first small studio space downtown when he realized he couldn't cover the rent. Shattered commercial equipment lease penalty, $14,200. Next was the credit card consolidation loan I had provided to keep his credit score from plummeting. Debt consolidation, $22,500. And the security deposit and first 3 months of rent for his luxury apartment overlooking the Sound after he claimed he needed an inspiring space to focus on his brand. Apartment lease rescue, $16,800. Finally, there was the initial seed capital I had quietly transferred to his business account when he first announced his dream of building his boutique gym franchise. Seed investment, $180,000. I sat back in my chair, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I let out a slow, shaking breath. The final total at the bottom of the column stared back at me in cold, digital black and white. $314,500. The amount itself wasn't going to ruin me. In the grand scheme of the logistics empire I had built and eventually sold, $300,000 was a manageable sum. I had spent far more on fleet maintenance and commercial real estate acquisitions over the course of my career. But the money wasn't the point. The point was what I had expected in return. I hadn't wanted gratitude. I hadn't wanted him to sing my praises or treat me like a savior. I had only wanted basic, human respect. I had wanted to sit at a family dinner without feeling the sharp edge of a young man's contempt. And somehow, that simple dignity had proven far more expensive than any check I had ever written. I pushed away from the desk and walked into the kitchen to pour a fresh cup of coffee. As I stood by the counter, my phone buzzed. It was Sandra, an old acquaintance from the local horticultural society. She was a sweet woman, but she was also the kind of person who accidentally knew everyone's business because she loved to chat. "Elena, dear," Sandra said when I answered. "I was just thinking about you. I ran into some of Julian's friends at the nursery yesterday, and we were talking about the wedding preparations." "Oh, yes," I said, keeping my voice light. "It's keeping everyone busy." "Well, I must say, I always admire how supportive Arthur is," Sandra continued, her tone entirely innocent. "It's so lovely that he works so hard to make sure you can enjoy your retirement and focus on your little greenhouse. Not many husbands would carry the financial weight so willingly these days." I froze, the ceramic mug cold against my fingers. "What do you mean, Sandra?" There was a brief, awkward pause on the line, the sound of her shifting her phone. "Oh, well, you know. Just that Arthur handles all the heavy lifting. He's always so modest about it, but he's mentioned how glad he is that he can provide a comfortable life for you so you don't have to worry about the real world anymore. My chest felt suddenly tight, as if the air in the kitchen had turned to lead. Arthur said that? Oh, not in a bad way, dear. Just, you know how men are. They like to feel like the provider. I just thought it was sweet. After a few more polite exchanges, I hung up the phone and stood staring at the rain-streaked window. The pieces of the puzzle were finally clicking into place, and the picture they formed was incredibly ugly. The narrative hadn't started with Julian. It had started with Arthur. Arthur, who wanted to look like the wealthy, successful patriarch in front of his son and his son's wealthy future in-laws. Arthur, who had quietly allowed everyone to believe that my retirement was a luxury he was funding. He had taken my desire for a quiet, unassuming life and turned it into a story of financial dependence to feed his own ego. He had let his son believe I was a gold digger because it made him look like the golden provider. A cold, hard anger, different from any anger I had felt before, began to bloom deep in my chest. I walked back into my office and dialed a number I hadn't called in nearly 2 years. "Tom," I said when my attorney answered. "I need you to pull the deeds and corporate filings for all my commercial properties. Specifically, the logistics warehouse in Kent." There was a brief pause, followed by the sound of keys tapping. "The one currently leased to the regional shipping firm, Elena?" "Yes." "And Tom, I want a complete audit of any recent inquiries, easement requests, or financial filings associated with that address. I have a feeling someone has been making assumptions about who owns it." "Give me 24 hours, Tom said, his voice instantly shifting into professional focus. "I'll run a full title search and check for any outstanding commercial filings." "Thank you," I said. Around 4 o'clock that afternoon, I heard the garage door open. Arthur's car pulled into the driveway. I stayed in my office, minimizing the spreadsheet before he could see it, and waited. A few moments later, his footsteps sounded in the hallway, and he knocked softly on the doorframe. He looked tired, his tie slightly loosened, a tentative smile on his face. "Hey," he said, leaning against the door. "You okay? You left the hotel so early last night." I looked at him, really looked at him, seeing the subtle lines of vanity and weakness I had spent 5 years overlooking. "I was tired, Arthur," I said quietly. "Yeah, wedding stress is getting to everyone," he said, completely missing the coldness in my voice. "Julian was just tense last night. You know how he gets when he's under pressure. He didn't mean anything by those jokes." "Of course," I said, my voice flat. "It was just a joke." Arthur smiled, relieved by my apparent compliance. "Exactly. I'm glad you understand. We're a family, Elena. We have to stick together." He walked away down the hall, leaving me alone in the dimming light of the office. I opened the spreadsheet again, staring at the number. $314,500. I knew then that the time for quiet patience was officially over. I was going to draw a line, and I was going to make sure everyone in this family finally learned exactly who had been holding up their world. The letter wasn't dramatic. There were no threats, no yelling, and no accusations. It was just one page, single-spaced, printed on ordinary white paper. Yet, it caused more chaos than any argument I had ever had in my 54 years. 3 days after my meeting with Marcus at the diner, I left the letter on the kitchen counter before sunrise. Then, I climbed into my old pickup truck and drove to a small, weathered diner in West Seattle, overlooking the gray expanse of Elliott Bay. I needed a few quiet hours before the storm arrived. At my age, you learn something important: big decisions are almost always made in silence. The shouting only comes afterward. I sat in a vinyl booth, drinking black coffee and watching the city wake up through the condensation on the window. Outside, container ships moved slowly across the dark water of the Sound, guided by tugboats. It was a world I understood intimately: logistics, coordinates, heavy machinery. A simple, predictable, peaceful world. That was the life I had wanted when I retired. Instead, my phone began to ring at exactly 8:14 a.m. Arthur. I let it go to voicemail. 30 seconds later, it rang again. Then again. By the time I finished my toast, he had called 6 times. I finally listened to the voicemail while walking back to my truck in the drizzling rain. "Elena, what is this?" His voice was thin, strained, a pitch higher than usual. "What does this letter mean?" "Elena, call me. Please." I stood beside my truck, staring at the low, slate-gray clouds hanging over the Seattle skyline. I felt no anger, no satisfaction, only a cold, quiet certainty. The letter said exactly what I meant, nothing more and nothing less. Effective immediately, I would no longer be funding Julian's upcoming wedding. I would no longer cover his unexpected business expenses, his lease penalties, or his personal loans. I was withdrawing my $35,000 venue deposit, which the country club had agreed to refund to my account since the contract was in my name. Any future financial assistance, if there ever was any, would be discussed on a strict, case-by-case basis. No assumptions. No automatic access. No blank checks. Most importantly, I had explained why. Not because of Julian's insulting toast at the rehearsal dinner, but because I had finally realized that generosity without boundaries eventually becomes expectation. And expectation, left unchecked, always becomes entitlement. I arrived back at the house around 10 o'clock. Arthur was waiting for me in the kitchen, pacing the hardwood floor. The letter was clutched in his hand, the paper slightly crumpled. His face was pale, not the flushed red of anger, but the hollow, bloodless pale of deep worry. "Tell me this is some kind of mistake," he said, holding up the paper. I set my keys on the counter. "It's not a mistake, Arthur." He stared at me, his eyes wide. "You're pulling the wedding funding. 2 weeks before the ceremony. Elena, the invitations are out. The catering is locked in. You can't do this to them." "I am ending a financial arrangement that should have ended years ago," I replied, my voice steady and calm. "This is because of what Julian said at the dinner, isn't it?" Arthur stepped closer, his expression pleading. "He's a young guy, Elena. He was trying to be funny in front of Chloe's family. He didn't mean anything by it." "No, Arthur. It's not just about Julian." I leaned against the kitchen island, crossing my arms. "For 5 years, I have tried to be a part of this family. I have quietly paid the bills. I have rescued Julian from every failed venture, every bad lease, and every credit card debt. And in return, I have been treated like an inconvenient dependent." Arthur looked down at the letter, his jaw tightening. "I didn't know you felt that way. Why didn't you ever correct people, Arthur?" He frowned, looking genuinely confused. "Correct who about what?" "The people who think you are supporting me. The people who believe I retired to live off your hard work." His face changed instantly. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible shift, a slight tightening around his eyes, a sudden stillness in his posture. It was the look of a man who realized he was no longer dealing with someone he could easily distract or placate. "It wasn't like that," he muttered, rubbing his forehead. "They were just harmless jokes, Elena. I didn't think it mattered." "It mattered to me," I said quietly. "You let your son believe I was a gold digger because it made you look successful. You let Chloe's family believe you were the sole provider because it fed your vanity. You built your pride on my silence." Before Arthur could answer, his phone began to ring. The screen lit up with Julian's name. Arthur answered it immediately, pressing the phone to his ear. Even from a few feet away, I could hear Julian's voice, loud, panicked, and furious. "What is she doing?" Julian was shouting. "The venue coordinator just called me. The deposit was withdrawn." "Arthur, what is going on?" I didn't stay to listen to the rest of the conversation. I walked down the hall to my office and closed the door, leaving Arthur to explain the reality of the situation to his son. The rest of the day was a barrage of calls and messages. Julian called my phone 16 times. I didn't answer a single one. By 6 o'clock in the evening, another call came through. This time, it wasn't Julian. It was Chloe. I hesitated, then answered. "Hello, Chloe." Her voice was quiet, trembling with embarrassment. "Elena? I am so sorry to call you. I know things are incredibly tense right now." "It's all right, Chloe. You don't need to apologize. I don't know everything that's going on between you and Julian," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "But I think you deserve to know the truth about some things. Julian, he hasn't been honest with you. Or with me." I sat down at my desk, pulling the phone closer. "What do you mean?" "Julian booked a massive VIP grand opening launch party for his new gym franchise, Aura Fitness," Chloe said, sounding thoroughly miserable. "It's scheduled for next month at a luxury, glass-walled loft downtown. The rental fee is astronomical, and he's already signed the contracts." "Using what money, Chloe?" There was a long, heavy silence on the line. "He told the venue management that his father would be transferring the funds this week. He told me that you and Arthur would handle any overages from the wedding budget and cover the launch party as a business investment." I closed my eyes, a cold wave of realization washing over me. The entitlement was staggering, but it was what Chloe said next that truly chilled me. "And there's something else, Elena. Julian has been talking to commercial real estate brokers. He's been telling people that he's securing a massive expansion loan for Aura Fitness, and that he's using the logistics warehouse in Kent as collateral." I sat up straight, my heart stopping for a beat. "The Kent warehouse?" "Yes," Chloe whispered. "He told the brokers that the warehouse belongs to his father, and that Arthur is signing over a commercial easement to him. He's been planning this for months." I felt a dangerous, quiet anger settle deep into my bones. The logistics warehouse in Kent was the crown jewel of my remaining commercial assets. It was worth millions, leased to a major shipping firm, and it was solely, entirely mine. I had bought it 7 years before I ever met Arthur Vance. Arthur had absolutely no legal claim to it, and Julian had even less. "Thank you for telling me this, Chloe," I said, my voice dropping into a low, calm register. "You have no idea how important this information is." "I'm so sorry, Elena," she said quietly. "I didn't want any of this." After we hung up, I sat in the dimming light of my office for a long time, staring at the framed photograph of my first greenhouse crew. Julian wasn't just planning his wedding around my money. He was planning to leverage my life's work to fund his vanity project, operating under the arrogant assumption that my assets were his for the taking. My phone buzzed on the desk. A text message from Julian. "We need to settle this publicly." I stared at the screen, a cold smile touching my lips. He wanted a public stage. He wanted to use pressure and embarrassment to force me back into compliance. He had no idea that he had just handed me the perfect venue to end his delusions once and for all. The invitation arrived 3 days later. It wasn't an email or a text, but a physical card made of heavy, textured cardstock with minimalist gold lettering, the kind of stationery designed to project an image of effortless wealth and success. Julian had titled the event, Aura Fitness, a celebration of vision, family, and new beginnings. I couldn't help but feel a cold amusement when I read those words. By then, my attorney, Tom, had finished his investigation into the Kent warehouse. The results had been worse than I anticipated, yet entirely predictable. Julian hadn't just been talking to brokers, he had actually submitted a loan application for a $500,000 commercial expansion. To secure it, he had forged my signature on a commercial easement and a secondary collateral agreement, leveraging my multi-million-dollar logistics warehouse. He had assumed Arthur was the sole owner, or perhaps he believed I was too detached, too retired, to ever audit my own holdings. He had gambled his entire future on my continued silence. I didn't call the police immediately. Instead, I coordinated with Tom, the commercial lending bank, and Marcus Sterling. Marcus was a man of absolute integrity. When Tom presented him with the certified proof of Julian's forgery, his reaction was a quiet, terrifying rage. He refused to let his daughter marry a white-collar criminal who was actively trying to ruin her family's reputation. Together, we quietly laid the groundwork for the launch party. The venue was a chic, glass-walled loft in downtown Seattle, overlooking the dark, shimmering waters of Elliott Bay. When I arrived on Saturday evening, the space was already packed with Seattle's young, wellness-obsessed elite, local influencers, and prospective investors. Soft, ambient lighting bounced off the polished concrete floors, and waiters in black attire circulated with trays of organic champagne. Julian was in his element. He moved through the crowd in a custom-tailored suit, laughing, shaking hands, and radiating the easy confidence of a man who believed he had finally made it. Arthur stood near the bar, looking slightly out of place but trying his best to project the image of the proud, wealthy patriarch who had funded this entire empire. Chloe stood beside Julian, but her eyes were red-rimmed and she kept her gaze fixed on the floor. I found a quiet spot near the back, far from the polished wooden stage where a microphone stood waiting. For 40 minutes, I watched the spectacle. Every detail of the loft, from the custom-built training turf to the imported light fixtures, represented money Julian didn't have. He had built this entire dream on a foundation of stolen collateral, expecting me to quietly absorb the debt when the bank eventually came calling. At 8 o'clock, Julian stepped onto the stage. He tapped the microphone, and the room fell silent. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Julian said, his voice echoing smoothly through the loft. Aura Fitness isn't just a gym. It's a vision of holistic strength, built on the values of discipline, community, and above all, family. There was a round of enthusiastic applause. Julian smiled, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. His expression hardened slightly, a flash of arrogant triumph passing over his features. "I want to take a moment to recognize the people who made this possible," Julian continued, his tone shifting into something more pointed. "In business, you quickly learn who is truly in your corner. Some people offer nothing but skepticism and closed doors. They hoard their resources and walk away when you need them most. But true family, like my father, Arthur, steps up. They believe in the future." A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd. Arthur puffed out his chest, smiling warmly. Julian was using his public stage to take one last, desperate swipe at me, attempting to paint me as the selfish, unsupportive stepmother in front of his entire professional network. Before he could continue, a man in a dark, tailored suit stepped onto the stage from the side. It was the venue manager, accompanied by a representative from the commercial lending bank. The manager carried a velvet-lined, wooden VIP Founder's gift box, the kind Julian had prepared for his top-tier investors. Julian paused, looking confused but trying to maintain his professional smile. "Ah, it looks like we have a special presentation." The bank representative took the microphone from Julian's hand. The room grew quiet, sensing a shift in the evening's program. "My name is Robert Vance, no relation," the representative said, his voice carrying a dry, legal authority. "I am the Senior Commercial Risk Officer for Pacific Crest Union. We are here tonight to deliver a formal, certified notification regarding the commercial expansion loan for Aura Fitness." Julian's face went completely still. I think there's been a mistake. We're in the middle of a private presentation." "There is no mistake, Mr. Vance," the representative replied, opening the velvet-lined box and pulling out a thick, legal document printed on heavy paper. "As of 4 o'clock this afternoon, Pacific Crest Union has officially voided the $500,000 commercial loan application for Aura Fitness due to the discovery of material fraud and the forgery of ownership signatures on the collateral assets." A collective gasp rippled through the glass-walled loft. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the city traffic outside. Furthermore, the representative continued, handing the document to Julian. A formal foreclosure and eviction notice has been issued for this property, as the lease agreement was secured using the fraudulent loan as collateral. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises. Julian stared at the paper in his hands, his face turning a hollow, bloodless white. His hands began to shake, the gold-lettered invitation on the stage floor fluttering in the draft from the ventilation system. He looked like a man who had stepped off a cliff and only just realized there was nothing beneath him. "This is ridiculous," Julian stammered, his voice cracking. My father owns the collateral. He signed the easement." Marcus Sterling stepped forward from the front row, his face carved from granite. "No, Julian. Your father doesn't own the Kent warehouse. He never did. And neither do you." Arthur looked as if he had been struck by lightning. He stared at his son, then at me, the realization of Julian's crime finally breaking through his vanity. "Julian, what did you do?" Julian didn't answer. He couldn't. The microphone remained silent on its stand, and the glittering crowd of Seattle's elite began to whisper, their eyes darting between Julian's pale face and the legal document in his trembling hands. The illusion of aura fitness had shattered in a matter of seconds, leaving behind only the cold, unyielding reality of his own deceit. Without another word, Julian turned and walked off the stage, disappearing into the back offices of the loft. Chloe followed her father out of the building without looking back. The party was over. The house north of the city was quiet for the first few days after the launch party. Not a peaceful quiet, but the heavy, exhausted silence that follows a devastating storm. Arthur stayed in the guest room. He didn't defend Julian, and he didn't try to make excuses for his own complicity. He spent his days sitting on the back porch, staring out at the rain-drenched trees, looking smaller and older than I had ever seen him. A month passed, then two. The wedding was officially cancelled, and the lease on the downtown loft was terminated. Julian's fitness franchise dissolved before it ever truly began, his reputation in the Seattle business community permanently ruined. One evening, as the autumn leaves began to fall, Arthur sat down across from me at the kitchen table. The house was warm, the smell of cedar wood smoke lingering in the air. For a long time, neither of us spoke. "I failed you, Elena," Arthur said quietly, his voice thick with a regret he had carried for months. "I let my own pride, my own foolish desire to look successful, blind me to what my son was doing. I let him treat you like an outsider because it made me feel important. I am so sorry." I looked at him, seeing the genuine sorrow in his eyes. It was the first honest conversation we had shared in 5 years. "It takes time to build trust, Arthur," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "And it takes even longer to rebuild it when it's been broken. But we can start by being honest about who we are." He nodded, a quiet tear slipping down his cheek. "We didn't magically fix our marriage that night, but we stopped pretending. And in the real world, that is where healing actually begins." Nearly a year later, my phone rang on a quiet Saturday morning. I was sitting in my greenhouse, surrounded by the rich, damp smell of soil and blooming orchids. I wiped my hands on my apron and answered. "Elena?" It was Julian. His voice sounded different, older, quieter, stripped of the arrogant edge that had defined him for so long. He was working as a trainer at a commercial gym in Tacoma, living in a modest apartment, and finally paying his own bills. "Hello, Julian," I said. There was a long pause on the line. "I wanted to call, to apologize. Not for the money, or the gym, but for how I treated you. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about everything." I looked out the greenhouse window at the gray Seattle sky, feeling the cool, clean air of the morning. The anger was gone, replaced by a deep, settled peace. "Thank you, Julian," I said quietly. "I appreciate you telling me that. We didn't become close, and we didn't pretend the past hadn't happened. But we had established boundaries, and through those boundaries, we had found a way to exist without contempt. I have spent my life building things, businesses, greenhouses, and a quiet retirement. But the most important thing I ever built was the courage to stand up for my own dignity, to draw a line in the wet Seattle soil and say, no further. Because kindness without limits isn't generosity, it's just a slow surrender. And some things are far too valuable to ever give away. Lessons from this story. Generosity without boundaries eventually turns into entitlement. Silence and hiding the truth can allow others to construct harmful narratives. True dignity requires standing up against betrayal, even within a family. Building self-worth on lies and vanity will inevitably lead to ruin.